Hi everyone, and welcome to the BCRC webinar on methods to dispose of cattle mortalities to reduce predation. My name is Stacy Domalewski, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. So if you're on Twitter, you can tweet along with us using #BeefWebinar. We are also going to be recording this session as well, so if you missed anything tonight, you can watch it again. I also would encourage you to take some notes as well so that you can look up anything that we've talked about later if you have anything you'd like to follow up on. So of course for tonight, you'll be able to hear and see the presenters tonight, but we won't be able to hear and see you. So if you would like to communicate with us, just type into the small chat window on the control panel on the side of your screen. If you have a question or comment for either of tonight's presenters, you can type it in there and they'll answer it towards the end of the hour. If your internet connection is a bit slow tonight, it might help to close the webcam window. It means you won't be able to see the presenters, but it'll hopefully make through the audio and the presentations come through a little bit clearer. All right, so let's get started. So here's what we're going to be covering for tonight. We'll start it off. You'll hear from Dr. Mark Boyce from the University of Alberta. Then we'll hand it over to Dr. Kim Stanford to talk about methods of disposal. And then we'll open it up to any questions from you. And we'll finish the webinar by letting you know where you can find more information that you'll be interested and be able to use on your farm or ranch. So with that, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker of the evening, Dr. Mark Boyce. Dr. Boyce is a world leader in wildlife ecology and conservation biology. Presently, he holds the Alberta Conservation Association Chair in Fisheries and Wildlife. At its core, Dr. Boyce's research is based on the premise that humans can coexist with wildlife and it makes our lives better. And he's actually coming to us tonight from one of their remote research camps. So thank you for being here with us tonight, Dr. Boyce.
My pleasure.
All right.
Okay, I think I'm going to get rid of this webcam because it's right in the middle of the screen.
No problem.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to review some research that we've been doing in southwestern Alberta. We started this work in 1997, and there have been a number of students who've been involved. And we've had studies on elk, on cougars, on wolves, and grizzly bears, all in the same area. And we're just starting a new study on black bears again in the same area. It's in the Pincher Creek area north of the Waterton Lakes National Park, north almost to K Country, up to Chain of Lakes and that area. So the focus of my presentation tonight, though, is going to be mostly about wolves, because wolves are the real culprits and have been the biggest problem as it relates to beef producers. We've had almost no depredation by cougars at all of livestock. They like llamas, but very few beef cattle have been killed in western Alberta by cougars. Wolves, on the other hand, take quite a few cattle in southwestern Alberta. Grizzly bears occasionally will kill cattle. They're more of a problem because they show up at boneyards. So just a little bit of background. There was a very aggressive control program during the 1950s and 60s. Started actually in 1956 with a rabies outbreak in Arctic foxes in the north and spreading into other canids, and so there was very aggressive control using strychnine poison and heavy trapping and shooting. And they pretty well eliminated wolves from southwestern Alberta. And in fact, wolves were gone even from Banff National Park until the late 70s. They started to show up again, and in the 1980s. There were wolves in Jasper National Park and in northern Alberta, right on through, but fewer than 1,000 of them. Current numbers of wolves in Alberta are estimated by the province to be about 7,000. I think that's probably a little bit high, but somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 wolves in Alberta. Wolves are killed to protect ungulates and livestock, but the provincial government encourages ranchers to deal with wolves on their own. And if they have depredation problems, they are free to enlist the support of trappers. They can take wolves any time. There's no season or limit on the number of wolves that can be removed. But the provincial government has not been removing wolves, for the most part, for the last several years. They certainly did do, but they've backed off on that. The biggest wolf control programs in the province right now are in northwestern Alberta, where there's a threatened caribou herd, where the primary cause of mortality is wolf predation. So we have a predator compensation program in Alberta, and it's funded by revenues from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses primarily. It's managed by the Alberta Conservation Association. It's not managed by the Alberta Conservation Association. They pay. And the provincial government has an assessment program, and if it's a confirmed loss due to predators, with the exception of coyotes, then 100% of the market value is reimbursed. If it's a probable loss, 50%. If they're just missing animals at the end of the summer, there's no compensation for those losses. Southwestern Alberta accounts for 37% of all paid claims, even though we're only talking about 3% of the provincial land base. Most of these claims are from wolves. So this is a special area because the mountains where there's habitat for large carnivores and the prairies come abruptly together, and there's very high proximity between livestock grazing and these three large carnivores. So this is the Livingston Range, just north of Pincher Creek. And so for our wolf study, we've focused on an area in the Rocky Mountains, west of Pincher Creek, including Bob's Creek, north of Crow's Nest Pass, and areas south of Pincher Creek, right down to the Waterton Lakes National Park boundary. And so we worked on a new method for determining where kills were happening, and these involved using GPS radio collars where we had a fix every hour, and we could upload the data onto a receiver, and so about once a week or so we'd go out and upload data off the wolves, and then if we saw a cluster of GPS relocations in the same place, we go to that spot to see if there was a kill there. And we compared this cluster analysis to scat analysis during the non-grazing season and during the grazing season to see how well they compared. So the cluster method involved downloads every 7 to 10 days, and we looked for clusters. We had an algorithm that sorted through the data and identified where there was a cluster where the animals were spending more than 3 hours within a 100-meter radius location. So if they were concentrated in one location, one of the reasons that they might be concentrated in that same location would be that they've got a kill. And so this is just an example showing some of the clusters of kills for the Castle Carbondale pack west of Pincher Creek, and then we classified these clusters as to whether, after visiting the site, whether it was a kill, whether it was a scavenging site, whether it was a bed or a den or a rendezvous site. And so we visited 698 GPS clusters, wolf clusters, and 213 of these were kill sites or scavenging sites. There were 299 that were bed sites. And so the next couple of slides are sort of key results, because there are very pronounced differences between the seasons. So the non-grazing season is essentially from the end of October until cattle are put out, usually at the end of May, and so the non-grazing season, essentially the winter time, winter and spring, we have substantial number of deer and elk being taken. 37% of the prey items killed were deer, and about 12% were cattle. 19% of the items on which we had clusters were scavenge sites. But during the grazing season, when livestock were in the backcountry in particular, 45% of the prey items were cattle, with 22% of the prey being elk, deer, and 13% being elk. So the most predominant prey of wolves during the grazing season, that is from basically June, July, August, September, October, were cattle. And in fact, it's actually more pronounced than is illustrated here, because cattle weigh a lot more than these other prey, and so they constitute even more of the total biomass of prey being killed by cattle. And that's what's illustrated here, that during the grazing season, the black bars, you can see the percentage biomass of deer, elk, moose, and cattle taken by wolves, and 74% of the biomass taken during the grazing season were cattle. During the non-grazing season, you can see that elk are actually more important than cattle, but cattle are still a substantial component of the diet, even during the winter. Now, we compared those results based on these clusters to the diet based upon scat and the composition of scat. And the numerical comparison is somewhat different, just because of the metrics that are available, the percent of these prey in scat items. But the pattern is quite similar in that cattle and elk and deer are far and away the most important prey during the non-grazing season. And we have other prey, less than 10 kilograms, including beaver and bobcat, that other smaller prey that don't show up at all in the clusters, because it takes a larger prey item to keep the wolves on a site for at least 3 hours. Whereas smaller prey are oftentimes missed using the cluster method. But we pick those up using scats. You can still see that the smaller prey really don't amount to much anyway, so it doesn't make all that much difference. And if you look at the grazing season, we see exactly the same pattern, that the relative biomass of cattle in the diet is far and away greater than anything else. And so in terms of the frequency of prey items, small prey actually are more common in scat. You find lots of little things that they pick up on, but in terms of the relative biomass based upon the scat analysis, cattle are far and away the most important prey. So just to summarize here, during the grazing season, there's really no difference in the methods, and cattle are far and away the most important prey for wolves. Whereas during the non-grazing season, cattle are third in terms of their rank, and the scat versus GPS cluster gives you slightly different results, with the elk being first and deer second in the scat analysis, and deer being first and elk second in the GPS cluster method. But by and large, we get the same result. I mean, it's a very similar result overall. So the downside of using GPS clusters is that you miss smaller prey, but that amounts to less than 8% of the biomass of the diet anyway, so it's probably not a big deal. The downside of scat is that you get only what they ate, not what they killed necessarily. And wolves certainly take quite a bit of carrion and scavenge animals that they encounter. Roadkills, for example, and animals killed by other predators. So scavenging is an important part of their diet as well. So both methods for assessing the diet are effective and reveal the seasonal change in wolf diets. And an important observation based upon the radiotelemetry data was that wolves, cougars, and grizzly bears systematically visited boneyards. And so boneyards are where ranchers dispose of dead stock, and we see, for example, if you follow a wolf pack, they will systematically go from boneyard to boneyard to boneyard. They might encounter some other some prey that they'll pursue, and then they'll go to another boneyard, and they're systematically checking up on these boneyards to see if anything fresh has been put on. And far and away, the major source of depredation by large carnivores in southwestern Alberta are by wolves. Cougars were very well behaved in southwestern Alberta and took very few cattle. Grizzly bears would certainly take some. Grizzly bears certainly visited boneyards in a big way, and reported conflicts or incidents with grizzly bears were very heavily tied to boneyards. And 85% of the scavenge events that we observed for wolves were at boneyards, and they repeatedly visited the same boneyards. They go back, and this is true for wolves and cougars and grizzly bears. It's legal to have boneyards on your ranch in Alberta, but boneyards became much more common after BSE was discovered in Alberta in 2003. And we've seen some success with carcass disposal bins. And this shows the incidence of associated with dead stock, and you can see that there were about 20 per year prior to 2003. 2003 is when CFIA regulations came into effect that made it very cost prohibitive to use rendering trucks to come collect carcasses, and so you can see that the number of dead stock reported by rendering companies dropped precipitously after these CFIA regulations went into effect, and the number of incidents associated with boneyards increased substantially after 2003. So management implications of our work, missing livestock was mostly due to wolves. When we began our project, ranchers were telling us that they believed that they were losing some stock to wolves, but we know that they had no idea how many they were losing. And using these cluster methods, we were able to identify where the livestock went missing, and we could identify the cause of mortality. So this is an area, though, of very intense overlap between large carnivores and cattle. So the magnitude of conflict between large carnivores and cattle is probably more severe in southwestern Alberta than, well, we know that it's more severe there than anywhere else in Alberta. And we also know that these disposal methods and the composting and collecting of carcasses has been very successful at reducing the risk of conflicts associated with large carnivores. So Andrea Morehouse and Joe Northrup are the people, the students of mine who did the majority of the work that I've reported on today. And we've had support from a number of sponsors and a large team of field technicians. Some of the names are listed here.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. So up next, we will be hearing from Dr. Kim Stanford. So Kim has been employed with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry since 1990 and has been a senior research scientist since 2009. Her work with mortality composted started first with sheep and then moved to cattle after BSE. Her previous studies led to improving mortality composting for livestock and mortality disposing within the province of Alberta. So Kim, you should be able to go there.
There we go. Get my here we go.
Fantastic.
Okay. So now I'm going to go through some of the different options. Once you've got your dead stock on farm, well, what are you going to do with them? So you have a few choices, and different choices work for different farms. So there's not any one perfect solution, but you just have to kind of pick the one that works best for you. And I'm not going to be talking about rendering or anything where the cattle are removed from the farm. I'm just going to be talking about things that you can do right on your farm. So I'll go through the options. Before you leap into an option, you need to know what your local regulations are, as these they can differ by province, and they can even differ by municipalities within a province. So there's variation, and in a lot of the options that I'm going to be talking about, you need to do some advanced planning. It's not something you can wait till you've got the dead cow staring you in the face. You need to have a bit of preparation in order to effectively deal with that mortality. So start with is just natural exposure, which Mark touched on as being it's legal in Alberta, but it is not legal in other parts of the country, and it may be legal, but it's also based on if someone complains, then it may suddenly not. It may no longer be legal, so it's sort of quasi-legal. If using natural exposure can lead to problems with disease, flies, odor, predation, water contamination. So it is easy and cheap, but it's one of those things where it seems too good to be true. You use this, you may be paying for it later. So that's all I'll say about that option. The next one, on-farm burial, which some people are using and are quite happy with. The first question is, well, how deep of a hole do you need? Well, it needs to be at least 4 feet deep to completely cover the carcass. And the location of where you're going to site your holes is important as well. So at least 500 feet from a well, 350 feet from a barn or a dwelling place. Things you've got to think about if you're going to use burial. It will smell. There's no way to get away with that. Water table is important. This slide was taken on a dairy farm that's in a real swampy location. Any place you would dig on that farm, any hole you would dig would be full of water. It's not a place where burial would work. Topography of your farm also is important. You don't want to be digging your burial site in a low spot where water is going to be standing. And if you've got a really hilly farm, you can't have a burial site on a side hill that might be washed out later. Once you bury cattle they're there forever. That is always a burial site. They're not going away. Soil type is a consideration. Clay soil is good, but a loose sandy soil where water will percolate through rapidly is less desirable. Another problem can be with scavengers. If you have your burial pit has to be closed. You don't want to have the boneyards that Mark was talking about. You need to have a closed burial pit, a covered pit. Having an open hole on your farm, it's a danger. If you're going to be driving equipment around, last thing you want to do is fall into your burial pit. I have seen on farms some burial pits where they've put on a nice metal lid or with hinges, something that will effectively cover your hole. You do need to prepare this in advance. As you know, it's pretty difficult to dig a hole in the Canadian winter. Lime will help control the odor, but over time you're going to need a lot of holes, and holes are not exactly easy to dig, and it can get fairly expensive to keep, like, a fair bit of equipment time to dig the proper holes. So the next method, and I'm just going to briefly touch on this, is incineration. It offers really excellent disease control, but most commercial incinerators are this smaller version that are commonly available, and cattle are way too big to fit into these commercial incinerators. So if you're planning to use incineration, unless you can get, this is an air curtain incinerator. Whoops, let's go back. I'm going too far. Page up. Sorry. Sorry. If you've got one of these, it can handle full size cattle carcasses, but these air curtain incinerators are not common items, not easy to find in Canada. Another thing is because incinerators, even though they have filtration systems and they're burning at a very high temperature, because of air quality issues, they're not legal everywhere. So you need, if you're going to think about incinerating, check out if it's legal. It's also fairly costly to get the necessary supply of fuel, and it also takes a considerable amount of time. If you have more than one mortality, you're going to have to wait till you can process them through your incinerator. Burning, a lot of people think burning and incineration are the same thing, and they're actually not. Burning is when you just pile some fuel on top of your carcass and light it on fire. Burning causes really extreme air pollution, and it's likely not legal wherever you're at in Canada. It's likely not. If you have a big open fire, it needs continuous supervision. It's not something you can walk away from, and it's quite difficult to dispose of the whole carcass. You have to keep pushing the carcass pieces back into the fire, adding more fuel before you can completely get rid of the carcass. So if your farm looks something like this island here, which features mostly your jet landing strip and no neighbors for like many hundreds of miles, then if you've got a really isolated farm, burning is something you can maybe consider. If you've got any neighbors that you can see, it's likely not. Just talk a bit about biodigestion. It has some benefits, as you can use the biodigester to generate some energy, produce some methane. It has merit, but in order to properly feed your biodigester, the carcasses need to be cut into pieces, and the smaller the pieces are, the better. So it's not something you can add a whole carcass to. Just like any a biodigester on your farm is kind of like having another head of livestock. It needs to be fed daily some readily fermentable material. You're feeding the microbes in the biodigester, and you've got to keep them alive and healthy, which takes some work. In Canada, because of our famous winters, you're going to need to have some supplemental heat to keep your biodigester working in the winters, which is going to be costly. And generally, the amount of money that it costs to build your biodigester is going to outweigh the amount of energy, the dollar value of the energy you can generate. But if you're able to capitalize on some really excellent government grant for gazillions of dollars, go ahead and set up your biodigester. I'm going to be talking next about compost, which is something I've done a fair bit of work. And with composting, it's really important that you do it the right way. So it's kind of, we'll be doing homes on composting. People have different ideas of what composting is, and some of those are wildly incorrect. And so sometimes people have had really bad experiences with composting, but they were not doing it right. To avoid problems with wildlife, with scavengers, you need to make good mortality compost. If you can see the faces of the animals like that you're trying to compost, if you can see the expression on their faces after you're supposedly done composting, you're not making good compost. This is more like a feeding trough, and if you're making bad compost, well, the predators, the bears, the wolves, whatever you've got, will just be flocking to your compost for good eating. So this is two versions of finished mortality compost. This first version, basically they just piled their cattle into in between some bales of straw and really didn't add anything else, just kept adding dead cattle. And you can see at the end of the day that didn't work very well. Whereas this is what finished compost should look like. It just looks like dirt, and it's not something that's going to attract predators. It's something you can use as a nice fertilizer as well. So it has other value. So the first thing, if you're going to consider composting, is you need to choose the right location on your farm to set up your compost piles. And you need to you got to find a location that you can get to year-round, good access, and someplace where you can have ready access to the other things that you need to put in your compost, which I'll get into later, but things like straw, manure, sawdust, spoiled grain, whatever it is that you're going to mix in with your dead cattle, you need to site it away from wells, water sources, buildings, and as well as not anywhere close to where you don't want your livestock running through your compost. That's just not a good idea. A well-drained site is important, with some sort of catchment for runoff is essential as well. Compost is not going to work if it's standing in water. Like if there's too much water, you're not going to be able to compost if it's underwater. So similar to biodigesting, the overall goal of composting is you're trying to maintain really happy aerobic bacteria and fungi. Those are the organisms that are actually doing the hard work of breaking down the carcasses. So when you're initially making your mortality compost, for starters, you should be lying your cattle down on their side. I've seen people that have tried to lay their cattle on their back with their feet sticking up in the air, and all that leads to is a bunch of non-composted legs that stick out of your compost pile and don't degrade. So lay the cattle down on the side. You need to keep space between your cattle. They can't be touching. If they're touching, that part for some reason will not degrade. And then you need to cover your mortalities so you can't tell that there's actually mortalities there. This is one of my coworkers, Brian Sexton, and he's a big guy. He's about 6'6". So you need to have a compost pile that's taller, at least as tall as Brian after you're done, so that you can't see any sign of the mortalities. So constructing your pile, you build it in layers. It's kind of like a really strange sandwich, and you just use whatever you've got on hand. Like composting is really a pretty forgiving process, and it can use things that are other waste products that are on your farm. So you can do a few different things, like use a base of old straw, add your mortalities on top, add a layer of manure on top. You can add some more straw if you want on top of that. Some people really swear by sawdust or wood chips, and if you're in an area of the country where that's available, that's an excellent base. Add your mortalities, add some more sawdust or wood chips, maybe mix that with manure. Sawdust mixed with the manure would be like rocket fuel for composting. You can use spoiled silage. You can use a lot of different things to build your compost. So one of the first things that is really important when setting up your compost is the water content of the materials that you're adding to your dead cattle. And how do you tell if things are too wet? Well, you can do something called a squeeze test, where if you grab the manure or other thing that you're going to use in the compost, if you can squeeze moisture out of that, it is too wet. The base layer that you're laying your cattle on, though, that you want as dry as possible. The base layer is like a big sponge to soak up any. Cattle actually contain quite a bit of water in the rumen, so that's released as the composting gets going, and you want a really dry layer of straw or wood chips or whatever you want to have on the bottom. Have that really dry. The stuff that goes over top of the cattle, that you need to do the squeeze test on, because you don't want that to be too wet or you will have problems. You need to build your windrows so that water runs off of them. You don't want water to be pooling on top of your windrows. The windrows also, if you make them too small, then it's much easier for them to dry out or get too wet when it rains. A good sized windrow that's built to repel water, even if you're in a torrential rainstorm a couple days after the compost has been constructed, it's still going to keep composting. It just forms its own little crust and away it goes. If you're building using sawdust as the cover, we've had problems with that in southern Alberta, as it gets too dry. Like the wind blows and the sawdust dries out too much. In other parts of the country where it's a higher humidity, that might work better. But in southern Alberta, we've had sawdust compost just be a little too dry. Next thing you're worried about when you're setting up your compost pile is a carbon source. And carbon is what the microbes that are going to be breaking down your cattle, that's their fuel. So you need to put a base of straw or your silage or your wood chips or moldy grain or whatever it is that you're trying to get rid of. Put that down on the ground at least 18 inches thick before you lay your cattle on top of it. The third thing that you're really concerned about is nitrogen content, and quite luckily for you, there's plenty of nitrogen in your dead stock, so that's good. Manure is a good amendment to put over top of your cattle, as it also has nitrogen and carbon. Soil, is not acceptable. Don't just take soil and mound over your cattle, because there's virtually no carbon, virtually no nitrogen, and microbial growth will be greatly inhibited. It won't work very well. So stick with things that have a bit of nitrogen and some carbon in for amendments. A big concern when setting up your compost pile is oxygen. And if you're not getting enough oxygen to your compost pile, that's the main reason that the compost, as I need to go up, that's the main reason that the compost fails to heat and doesn't work. Likely your manure or whatever you're using on top of the carcasses is too wet, and that can happen if manure is compacted or if it's just wet or lumpy. What we have done is run the manure through a spreader first to get it nice and small chunks, and then stockpile that manure, and that will work well for compost. It's all in the whole secret to composting is to set up your piles well, and if you do that, really there's no worries. It just composts by itself. But if you do a poor job of setting up your compost piles, then you're up for a lot of work and a lot of trouble. So let's talk about the 3 T's. First one is time. How long does it take to compost your cattle? Well, approximately 9 months will fully degrade cattle, in feedlot weight. If you don't have a good setup for your compost pile, or if other problems arise, then it's going to take you more time. So if you got your good setup, it's quicker. You need to turn your compost, and in that 9-month period, we generally turned it 3 times, so about every 3 months. That last 9 months, the last turn would be at 9 months, and it's ready. You can spread it on the land at that time, or you can actually recycle your compost and use it in your next compost setup. What mixing does is just make it more homogeneous, and you don't need a commercial compost turner. All you need is a tractor with a bucket, and you just take the compost off the top of the pile, you lift it up, the bucket as high as it'll go, drop it into your, and I keep doing that, drop it into your location where you want to put the windrow, and that starts your new windrow, and that's what turns it. then when you're done turning your compost, especially in those initial, like your first turn, second turn, you need to add a little bit more, excuse me, cover onto that compost just to make sure that you don't have any chunks of mortalities exposed. Some people like to turn too much. You can actually, if you turn it too much, that'll actually slow down the composting. So you want minimal turning, but minimal but some turning. Let's talk about temperature. If the compost gets over 55 degrees Celsius, then you know you've got great pathogen control. You should be monitoring the temperature of the compost just so you know how well things are going. Here's two piles that were started in about the same time. This one had great heating, and you can see there's one little bone that's left when it was turned, versus this pile that did not heat well. You got a bunch of chunks, and this is out in the sun and baking. Like once bones are exposed to the sun like that, they get bleached. They're not going to break down. They're like buffalo bones. They're there for the foreseeable future. So the hotter the compost you get it, and the longer you can keep the compost stays hot, that gives you the more rapid breakdown of flesh and bone in your piles. So fourth P, I said there were three, but I'm lying, is troubleshooting. So when you start your compost pile, even if you're starting it in the winter, it should heat up fairly fast, just within the first few days of construction. If it doesn't heat and it's smelling bad, that's when it's too wet, and the only thing you can do is go in with your bucket and turn the compost, even if and just get some air into the piles. If regular compost does not smell bad at all, it just smells like whatever you're using for the amendments, manure or straw. Like it's not a bad smell. If your compost isn't heating and it doesn't smell bad, then it's probably too dry, and you need to add some wetter amendments and turn the compost. So if you're trying to compost in the winter, size definitely matters. So this is some of our composting sites, and this was a smaller, like, windrow. This was had multiple, like, double layers of cattle in this windrow. So the bigger the pile, better heat retention. It's like its own little thermonuclear reactor. It just keeps going, melts off the snow. It doesn't matter how cold it gets. And it really doesn't matter. It's not faster to compost in the summer versus the winter if you've got a big pile like this that just will keep on cooking. But to get winter compost started, I must stop doing that. To get compost started in the winter, you need to have something warm to start your pile. And the easiest thing to keep warm, unless you're going to be waiting for the instant for that animal to keel over, is to have a stockpile of warm manure that you can just add to your mortalities. And we've taken cattle that have been, well, frozen solid, we call them the cow sickles, and covered them with warm manure, and even though it was minus 37, it started heating, no problems. We had an active, nice compost pile. So in conclusions, year-round successful composting, it's possible in Canada even when the mortalities are frozen at the start. And the better you can initially do the setup, the faster the composting, and the less problems with scavengers and wildlife. As soon as your compost heats up to like 40 or more degrees Celsius, it doesn't smell like a carcass anymore. It's different. So it's not something that the wildlife are going to recognize as good eating. So good mortality composting, it takes some time and effort, but really you can, it's something that if you're willing to put in the time, you can adapt it to most farms. So into the poll questions that I don't know if so the two questions, just wondering, have you tried mortality composting? And second, are you planning to try mortality composting?
So I will launch the questions here. So you should see on your screen your answers to this. No one will be able to see what you're answering. So if you select one of the following, have you tried mortality composting? Either yes or no. All right. So
Okay.
it looks like about 30% have tried it, and 70% have not tried it.
Are they
So,
planning to?
well, we'll check that out next year.
Okay.
There we go. So, are you planning on trying mortality composting? So, once again, yes or no.
And if you're looking for more information on composting, Roping the Web of Alberta Agriculture, there's a number of manuals available online for composting various types of livestock. BCRC has a site as well that gives us some positives and negatives for different mortality disposal options. And then if you're trying composting and you're running into troubles, well, hey, send me an email. I may regret saying this later, but there's only 30 of you, so I think I should be able to handle it. Willing to answer your questions if you're needing some advice or running into problems, because that's what an expert is. It's someone who's made all the mistakes. So that's all I've got to say.
Sounds good. So, just an answer, there was about 70% that now say that they are going to try it, and about 30% that said no. So, switching that around
Okay.
there.
No, that's cool.
All right. So, we will go into the question and answer period now. So, on the side of your screen, you will see a question box. There you'll be able to type your questions in for either Mark or Kim. So if I can get both of you just to turn on your mics and your cameras as well, and just to let everybody know that their answers to the questions are anonymous. All right, so we had a few questions sent in beforehand. So the first question here is for Kim. So Kim, can you use manure as your base layer when you are composting?
Wouldn't recommend it, as you need something that's you want something that's really spongy, and usually the manure doesn't have enough carbon in it. Like, it'll have some. If you had manure that was like from a bedding pack, maybe, like, you want something with a good chunk of carbon, like lots of carbon to lay your carcasses on. So if you had really high test, high straw manure, that might work. But usually something else, like, that's got more spoiled grain or something that's got more carbon is a better base.
All right, thank you. So next to Mark, so you, in your presentation, you talked about how you saw grizzly bears were more likely to kill livestock after they'd visited boneyards. Did you find this with other livestock or with other carnivores as well, I guess?
We don't really have a good handle on that. I guess our supposition was that if the animals had a taste of cattle, that they would be more likely to depredate cattle. But we don't have any data to really demonstrate that rigorously. So I guess our thinking was that avoiding any contact with livestock as food is probably good management. But like I said, we can't definitively say that is how it works.
All right, thank you. So just a reminder that the questions panel or the chat panel on the side of your screen, you can type in your questions at, and for either of our experts there, we're running out of time, our hour is almost up, but if you do, we can answer a few more here. So another question here for Kim. So how effective is composting at destroying prions? Or to put it another way, is the method allowed for SRM destruction method?
We've actually done some work on that, and the short answer is that composting, yes, does a decent job of destroying prions. The present CFIA regulations are based on zero destruction, and CFIA has, in consultation with CFIA members, they have said they are trying to get the regulations changed, but nothing has happened to date. So I think that it certainly has potential for specified risk material, and it's certainly a cheaper option than some of the others. That it wouldn't be like not used for an animal that was confirmed with BSE, but for assumed healthy animals, I don't see any issues with using composting for, say, slaughter waste from like slaughter cattle.
Okay. So another question for Kim here. Does it make a difference if the compost pile is started on a concrete pad? Would that retain too much moisture?
Yeah, some people, like, concrete pads are fairly expensive to make. We've used like just sort of a clay pad works, and you can just pack it down. So I have seen problems with, like, it's better if it's like concrete pads also support more runoff, like leaving the it's better if all of the anything coming off of the compost stays in the near vicinity of the compost. So I'm not a big supporter of concrete pads, although I know that some places and maybe in some climates they might work better. But my thought would be just you don't need that expense.
Okay, sounds good. So a question for Mark here. You mentioned very briefly about bins as a method of to dispose of cattle mortalities. So would you recommend these in areas that of really high predation as opposed to other methods?
The bins have been pretty effective ways to get rid of calves in particular, and those are taken to municipal facilities for either for composting or incineration, and the bins basically are a way to keep the carcasses away from predators, and they work well in that capacity. And there's been very strong support by municipalities in southwestern Alberta to support various ways to reduce boneyards and to get rid of carcasses. So that, I mean, it seems counterproductive. In fact, if the reason that we are restricting the use of rendering and other ways of getting rid of carcasses, if the reason is to try to prevent the spread of BSE or other prion-based diseases, it seems counterproductive to leave the carcasses out so that predators can use them, because we do know that BSE and other prion-based diseases can be spread by carnivores. So it's not a very sound practice to use boneyards. So anything we can do to get rid of those carcasses and dispose of them using composting or incineration or whatever is certainly an improvement over boneyards. And it certainly reduces the potential for conflict with large carnivores, because all these large carnivores visit those boneyards, and it just increases the contact between humans and the large carnivores, and thereby increasing the probability that we're going to have some incident. With bears in particular, bears get themselves in trouble all the time with humans. I mean, wolves, for the most part, are a problem because they kill livestock, but they usually don't harass humans. But bears can be problematic because they potentially are dangerous to humans.
All right, thank you very much. Kim, one last question for you here, unless anybody has anything else. How do you know when carcasses are fully degraded?
Well, you need to go and turn your compost and see what's there. That's the only way. And if there's usually at the first turning, and if the compost successfully heated, there will be very little left. But you still want to degrade all like visible flesh and bones as well. So the only way is to open it up and look.
All right, perfect. Well, that looks like the end of our questions there. So I'd also encourage you to talk to your regional livestock specialist or extension specialist through your province to learn more about methods to dispose of livestock. So just a couple more things before we go here. So the first is how to get more information and science-based production advice through the BCRC. So you can go to our website at beefresearch.ca and click the subscribe button to sign up for our free email list. As Kim also mentioned, there is some resources there on composting as well, which I will include in a follow-up email as well. If you have Twitter, Facebook, or a YouTube account, you can connect with us there as well. And I would also encourage you to visit the Canadian Cattlemen's Association website, cattle.ca, where you can sign up for their free action news. I also wanted to remind you not to miss our next webinar. It will be a week from today, so November 24th, and we'll be talking about improving weaning weights, conception rates, and calf health. So lots of great information there. You can find this on our webinars page on our website, as well as in the information I'll be sending out as well. So shortly after this webinar ends, you'll be asked to complete a short survey that asks about tonight's session and what you're most interested in for future webinar topics. So we do need your feedback to do the best job we can to deliver information for you that's both useful and meaningful and helps you to make informed decisions on what's best for your operations. So please complete the survey and don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions. You'll also be receiving an email from me, as I mentioned, within a couple days with a link to watch the recording, as well as links to some additional information on both predation and methods of disposing of dead stock. So that's it for tonight. So I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and on behalf of everyone, I would like to thank Kim and Mark for volunteering your time and expertise with us tonight. So thank you very much.